Good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar in our autumn series. We are joined this afternoon by Dr. Cristina Caffarra. We're very grateful to have Cristina this afternoon. It's a bank holiday in London, but notwithstanding that, she's agreed to join us on the line today. So Cristina, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Cristina is one of the world's leading competition economists and also one of the leading economists in large mergers across the globe. I know she's a frequent globetrotter. She's been in South Africa for a number of big mergers, and I know she's off to the Philippines and works extensively in London and the US. So we're very grateful for the breadth of her international experience on these issues, and we're going to dive right into the topic straight away, and we're going to move to slide number 2. Now, I know Cristina is currently working on the Asda-Sainsbury's merger, which is obviously highly topical, and we're going to ask her just to give us a few thoughts and observations based on her experience in that. But Cristina, you've worked across the globe in various jurisdictions and various countries. And I guess the first question for you today is, do you experience a fairly consistent approach by competition regulators in the various jurisdictions in which you've worked on big merger analysis? Or do you think that there are different trends and approaches in different countries by various regulators?
Thank you, Anthony. And let me start first by thanking you for this opportunity and saying how pleased I am to be able to have this conversation with you. As you mentioned, I do a number of cases in a number of jurisdictions, but I've also been frequently in South Africa, and it is one of my favorite jurisdictions. I've done a number of cases there, and I particularly like the quality of the work and the type of analysis that we do there, and the way in which economic analysis engages quite extensively. So it is one of my treats to be coming to South Africa quite a bit. So as to your question, I think to talk about a consistent approach is perhaps not yet quite right, but my experience is that there is a huge degree of convergence in terms of how agencies articulate the concerns and increasingly how they assess them. Now, this is no longer the case of the classic triad, the US, the UK, and the European Commission. They've always been very aligned in terms of their substantive approach. But increasingly, what I can see elsewhere from a multiplicity of jurisdictions, South Africa is one, but also Brazil, Southeast Asia, you mentioned the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and even China and Russia. There is a growing degree of alignment on the fundamental question in merger analysis, which is essentially how much will the parties following this deal be able to increase prices, because the direct competition between them is removed and they no longer have to worry that they will lose customers to each other. That is at the core of merger analysis. It's known as unilateral effects because it is really about the merging parties and the extent to which coming together they can do their own thing and increase prices. Not because of some sort of cartel or collusion-like sort of mechanism with other firms, other competitors in the market, but simply, as I said, because they bring together, they eliminate the competition between them, and that removes the discipline that existed before the merger in terms of the price they set. And this question ultimately is posed in this way today pretty much regardless of whether the product is high-tech, low-tech, whether it is a basic chemical, it's a commodity. You can have it in a fast-moving consumer good, a bundle of products like a retail chain, piece of software. You can have social networks. You can have two-sided platforms. Regardless of the product, this is the question that the authorities are increasingly zooming in on, and it is posed in this way. And so while, as I say, there is a journey towards levels of sophistication and doing this, the question is clearly understood as being this at this point by everybody, I think.
And Christina, with that in mind, I think a lot of people on this call are probably interested in a pivotal question, which is when you're preparing for a big merger and you know that perhaps it's going to be carefully scrutinized by competition regulators, and you're thinking of the type of economic analysis and approach that you should be taking in advance of the merger, what are the kinds of analyses that you think parties should be thinking about in anticipation of filing a big merger? And, you hear lots of things about guppy tests, econometric evidence, survey evidence, diversion studies, elasticity of demand studies. I mean, these are all different types of economic analysis that parties can think about in these types of transactions. So what would you typically recommend are the types of studies that parties should be thinking about when they're embarking on a big horizontal merger?
Yes. Well, it does obviously depend on how competition works in a market and how does it unfold. And however, in every case, you really need to think about what kind of economic evidence and studies can help you answer that fundamental question that I posed earlier. How can we make predictions on whether prices will increase? And it is no longer the case, as it used to be the case years ago, that you kind of looked a bit at the market shares and you kind of decided if they're big, there's going to be a big problem. Because experience has shown that the reality is more subtle and more nuanced. And market definition, as we'll discuss later, is a very blunt instrument. Really, you want to be able to quantify to the extent possible that potential price increase. This is what it's all about, what 90% of merger analysis these days is about. And in order to quantify it, and it is important to quantify it, because if you can show that you're talking about something which is in the range of, say, 2-3%, you're not far away from a rounding error, really. And you stand a chance of saying to an authority, look, this is an increase that is marginal, it is not very meaningful, you should not intervene in this case. If you are, however, in the region of 5-10% or above, then that price increase is going to be something which you should realize is going to be problematic. The authority will come up with that kind of number, and then you need to think about how to address it. But in terms of defining that number, arriving at that number, as you say, there are different possible tools that one can use, and it depends on the type of competition that takes place in a market. So in a market in which companies are essentially procuring sort of services by sending around requests for quotation or RFPs, then you can do an analysis of how do they procure, right? And when do they ask for a quotation? Do they typically ask the merging parties to quote against each other, or is it the case that there's many others quoting for that piece of business, or we find that the merging parties are not head-to-head when trying to get at that piece of business? So that is hugely informative, because that tells you directly if they are really competing head-to-head and constraining each other at this point. And more generally, what you're trying to do is analysis that in each case try and get to how close the customers perceive the two merging parties when thinking about where to buy from. So it could be, as you said, consumer surveys. It can be analysis of churn that we do very frequently. So we look at the book of business of the two merging parties and we say, well, when customers sort of change and they move, do we know where they go to? Do they come here? Do they go over there? And so on. So there are various pieces of evidence that one can collate and ultimately can be brought to answering that fundamental question, which is if you are close enough in the customer's mind, then it is more likely that you will be able to raise prices because you are competing head to head. If one can show with the evidence that in fact you are one amongst the group and not particularly close to each other, and this can be quantified, then clearly that makes a big difference to your ability to defend the merger.
And do you think that there are particularly types of economic evidence or other extraneous evidence that are more reliable than others? So, for example, I know there are often debates about survey evidence and sample evidence about whether the sample is sufficiently representative or not. etc. And this often becomes a bit of a focal point in merger debates. And I guess I'd be interested in your view about, for example, we're recently dealing with the merger at the moment, where there is a big debate about the sample size and whether the sample size is sufficient. And, some would suggest that if the sample size is not sufficient, that evidence is not worth the paper it's written on. And I guess, I'd be interested in your views about those types of issues.
Well, very much so. If the problem with surveys is that they do not ultimately capture actual behavior in many cases. When you're looking at data about past purchases and past consumer behavior, it's black and white, is what they've done. So if prices went up, we see what they did. If prices went down because there was a special offer, we can see what they did, for example, in scanner data. We can look at actual outturns of manifestation of customer behavior. Surveys tend to be, of course, useful, but they are hypothetical in the sense that in many cases they are asking questions about, if you went shopping here today, where else would you go? Or if this store wasn't here today, where else would you shop? Or if you didn't find this product here, what? So to the extent that surveys are very much framed in hypothetical terms to capture consumer behavior, one needs to be very careful about the way in which questions are posed. And indeed, as you say, you also need to have a sample which is not only large enough but sufficiently representative. So it needs to be designed in a way that makes sense. I mean, there are guidelines out there. I mean, for example, the UK Competition Authority has a survey guideline in which they describe what kind of surveys would be acceptable to them and how you need to design them. So one thing I would say is that in my experience is enormously helpful once you know that the merger is obviously going to be notified. You can't do it in the early stages, but to engage with the agency and say, we plan to, the right thing to do is do a pilot first and figure out if you think it's going to be helpful. You don't want to jump straight into something that is going to be unknown. But, if you are planning to do a survey to support a position that you think is going to be favorable, then it's very, very recommendable to engage and say, we plan to run a survey with these characteristics, these questions, this size, and will you please sign off? Because that avoids the kind of problem you mentioned, right? That, there can be a dispute exposed about whether it is acceptable at all.
Absolutely. And I guess, a situation that often arises sometimes in these types of mergers, and you often hear this from regulators, is they say, we accept that the data or studies that we've done are not perfect, and we accept that they are fundamentally flawed in various respects, but it's the best we could do in the circumstances. And, this is a refrain that you often hear. And I guess, we would often suggest that, that type of data is not particularly helpful, because once you, admit or acknowledge that there are pitfalls in the data and that those can severely impact the results, it's questionable whether that type of analysis is ultimately particularly worthwhile or meaningful to the decision makers when they come to adjudicate the merger. And I'd just be interested in your views on best available type of evidence.
As I say, I think evidence from internal records, that is, that essentially looks at customer records, what they purchase, what they change, their churn, their behavior, bidding, and so on, tends to be the preferred data because it's objective. It comes from the company's record, and it is not disputable. Survey evidence can be very useful, but as you say, needs to be the survey needs to be designed in a way that is satisfactory before it can be attributed credibility. And I think in those cases, the very, very least that can be done is do a multiple of sensitivity analysis. Once as a regulator, you're trying to rely on that evidence, or as a party, you're trying to rely on that evidence, and say, asking yourself the question, how fragile are my claims based on this evidence? Because if you are on a knife edge and you have a survey that kind of supports a proposition just about, but then if you find that if you change things a little bit, really that proposition collapses because if you move the results of the survey a little bit and it's not quite what you say, everything is different, then that, I would submit, is not a very satisfactory way to proceed. If your survey ultimately supports a conclusion, but only just, and when you tweak the parameters, it doesn't work anymore, then I would say that's not robust, and no one should really be insisting that's reliable. So I think that there is clearly a hierarchy, if you like, of sources. One is at the top, you have the best evidence, which is internal company data. And then going through it, you also have surveys, but it needs to be certainly used with a pinch of salt. Another category, if I may, just for a second, of data and information, which certainly is in Europe having an enormous impact on mergers, is internal documents to complement the data. I mean, what we are seeing increasingly is that internal company documents, all sorts of communication between executives, but also all sorts of presentation and all sorts of studies, and all sorts of even minor communication between sales force and so on, are being effectively harvested and then analyzed quite carefully to put in context what the data say, and sometimes to come back to parties and say, well, you say that, but that's what your internal documents actually are saying. So again, this is an area which is more forensic, if you like, than economic, but it is an area where legal analysis and economic analysis need to really go hand in hand to be mutually supportive, I think.
And I suppose what flows from that is that parties really should do a bit of an internal due diligence, in a sense, about what their internal documents say, and make sure that the messages they are putting out there are consistent with their internal documents.
Completely. I mean, just to give you an example, you will have heard, all of you will know the big Dow DuPont case, and it was a big matter also there. But I mean, the way in which the European Commission felt really emboldened ultimately to adopt what were seen as very innovative theories about reduction in innovation, not increase in prices, but reduction in innovation effort, was the fact that when they trawled the internal documents, notwithstanding what the parties were saying about, this will be a great way to become more efficient in innovation, there were very clear internal plans that suggested that we're going to close this research facility, these other research facilities, we're going to rationalize, we're going to reduce the number of engineers and so on. And so what I'm saying is that the Commission went, aha, that was the voila moment in which they said, well, you can tell me anything, but this is what your internal documents are saying, and economic models aren't worth the paper they're written on, because this is what you're really thinking.
Absolutely.
Right?
Cristina, I want to sort of depart a little bit, and we're going to come back to it shortly, from the traditional competition analysis, and ask you a little bit about the role of public interest considerations, because in South Africa, sort of public interest considerations have enjoyed equal status with what I'd call mainstream competition analysis. And that's been the case for a couple of years now, and our Competition Amendment Act provisions make that explicitly plain. But it seems to me that public interest is even growing as a mainstream consideration in other international jurisdictions. And I just wanted to get your take about, is it a growing area of importance internationally, or are we in South Africa a bit of a special case?
Actually, I think that you are pioneers at this point. I mean, I was at a roundtable on Thursday in which heads of agencies were saying how South Africa is, in fact, ahead of the pack with this in terms of the way in which things are developing elsewhere. If you like, the world is catching up with you. So less facetiously, of course, as you say, for you and for very clear historical reasons, public interest has been a major plank in the merger regime for a long time. Incidentally, it used to be the case, as many of you will know, that also in the UK you had a form of public interest baked into the merger regime in the 70s and 80s, and only in the 90s it was taken away. And this has been very much worldwide the way in which things have gone until fairly recently, until very recently. The sort of driver for this was and has been for a long time this notion that ultimately what we care about when we do merger analysis our goal is consumer welfare. This is really what we're here to defend as competition agency. We care about whether prices will go up, because that's against the interest of consumers. Yes, we recognize there are a host of other things that one could worry about, from employment to the environment to what have you, but we are not particularly well equipped to make that kind of assessment. That's been throughout in the last 20 years, the logic. We are not well placed to make any kind of trade-off between consumer welfare and other objectives. We know how to do consumer welfare tests. We don't know how to somehow put it together with other things. And so we just know, we do what we know. And, you know, there is an increasing sense that was a bit of an attitude that in some sense you can think of an analogy of you're looking for your keys under the lamppost because that's where the light shines, right? And so you know what you're doing. We have tools to measure this price effect. We are far less sophisticated or capable of trading these off against other objectives. But I think two major factors are coming to really question that kind of received wisdom, even in the U.S., which has been always the sort of the standard bearer for consumer welfare. One is the sort of power of big tech and the tech giants, and the increasing sense that we have antitrust tools that are not generally well placed, well versed to help us deal with the issues that arise around tech and digital. So think, of course, of a world of zero prices in a two-sided and multi-sided platform. Think about multi-homing. How do you meaningfully measure market shares in these circumstances? You have a sense that there's been enormous under-enforcement in this area. So this is the kind of narrative that is developing out there. Google has bought 200 startups in the last 5 years, and nobody has ever heard of it because they tend to fly below the radar, because they don't have a market share, because they don't matter. But ultimately, there is an increasing question mark about whether we are capable of capturing things in a meaningful sense. And of course, WhatsApp, Facebook has been let go by the European Commission, and then the Commission had regrets and called them back because they said, oops, we didn't really sort of think at the time that this was going to be a problem. So this tech side of things, which is enormously preoccupying people, and the notion that, you know, the classic standards of merger analysis and antitrust are not well developed enough. And then there is the other strand, which is the whole concern about growing concentration. I know this is a major topic for debate in South Africa and has been at the heart of the discussion you had about the reform. But this is a broad worldwide concern. And there is evidence in the US, in Europe, elsewhere in developed economies, that essentially markets are becoming increasingly more concentrated. That's fact. And that the share of profit is going up, the share of labor is going down. So the split of the pie between profit and labor is going in a very particular way. And, you know, people are sort of, soul searching about this ultimately. There's a pretty militant, if you like, strand of progressive antitrust that says, look, you know, we've lost the plot here. We've allowed markets to become far too concentrated. This is not because necessarily just antitrust was ineffective, but because there's of course a lot of other factors in it. There's technology, there's whatever. But you know, it is a sense that somehow we now are in a paradigm in which markets are so concentrated that concentration in itself is becoming a problem. Therefore, public interest, the whole area of fairness, which is the way in which the European Commission puts it, rather than concentration, the whole area of dealing with, if you like, other types of concerns is back on the fore. Because the position is we've kind of dealt with consumer welfare for all this time, and look what we've got. Markets that are super concentrated, and that worries us. And so so for example, there was the ArcelorMittal Ilva merger in Italy just approved by the European Commission. And, you know, a big discussion that I saw there for the first time was about employment implications of that deal. Would not have happened 5 years ago. But it is a phenomenon which is growing. And in the UK, of course, you have Brexit, which is also a big engine behind this and is putting forward all sorts of consideration to do with, protection of public interest in the future. So I think this is going to be a major sort of return to public interest concerns going forward.
Well, I think the South Africans have wholeheartedly embraced the public interest criteria, and I think on our slides we've talked about three of the more high-profile cases where this came to the fore. The Walmart acquisition of Massmart, where the Competition Appeal Court ultimately imposed certain conditions, and those included a local supplier development fund. Workers were reinstated who had been retrenched in anticipation of that transaction, and there were also protections for collective bargaining arrangements. And then the most recent one is the AB InBev acquisition of SAB Miller, and there again there were very extensive public interest conditions, including commitments not to retrench any employees involuntarily, retention of aggregate employment levels for a period of 5 years, support for small businesses and emerging farmers, local procurement criteria, and also some divestments of certain interests in other players. And the last of the big three was the Coca-Cola merger of 3 bottling plants, and there again there were extensive public interest conditions, and interestingly also an empowerment condition which required an attainment of a 30% Black economic empowerment ownership target within a defined period. So I think, certainly from a South African point of view, public interest criteria are a paramount consideration in any big merger. And parties are really well advised to think very carefully about the public interest issues, almost on the same level as they would the competition issues, because,
yes.
Certainly from a South African point of view, I think they have equivalent status. And if one doesn't consider the public interest criteria carefully at the outset, you run the risk that the merger could be delayed, that there could be extensive interactions with various interested parties. And I think, in the same way, Cristina, as you suggested, that one has to think about the economics and traditional competition analysis carefully before you embark on a big merger. I think, equally, we would say that from a South African point of view, you have to consider the public interest issues with the same degree of prominence, and you have to think them through as carefully before you embark on a big merger, to make sure that when you ultimately file your transaction, that all these issues are catered for. And it sounds from what you're saying that certainly from a European and perhaps international point of view, that equal consideration needs to start being given to public interest issues if you're thinking of big international transactions.
Well, if you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said, or even 3 years ago, or even 2 years ago, perhaps, I would have certainly said, well, public interest remains a fairly specialty sport in South Africa with very well understood foundations in terms of the history and the objectives. What I'm saying is that although as yet it doesn't in international environment acquired us to the same prominence, obviously, as a competition analysis, there are very, very serious, thinking going on at the level of policy about how to broaden the competition footprint and perhaps to include some of these objectives which have been regarded as extraneous or something we can deal with. So I would say that although maybe not with the same degree of prominence, I think I'd expect these kind of considerations to come to the fore much more in international deals, I think.
Cristina, can I revert back to traditional horizontal merger analysis? And I'd like to spend a bit of time with you going through some of the key issues and key criteria that regulators often look at in these cases, and perhaps to debate with you which of these factors or criteria you think are particularly important in merger analysis today. And perhaps to start with the issue of market definition, which always was traditionally the starting point. And we know in some mergers can make the difference between success and failure. And I think one of the cases we were discussing was, for example, in casino mergers, this question often comes up about, do casinos which are in different geographic localities compete with one another? And often the debate has been, well, are they in separate geographic markets, in which case they don't compete, and therefore there's no horizontal overlap and the merger should be cleared immediately? Or can you define markets more broadly to include regional competitors? So I would be interested just to understand your view on market definition and whether you think that still plays the central role that it used to, or do factors like closeness of competition now assume increasing importance in merger analysis?
Well, certainly market definition, I think, is decreasing in importance as a broad generalization. And the reason is that, and when you take a step back, it used to be the case that, of course, it was a fairly blunt, you're in or out of the market. If you can widen the market and the share is bigger, if you narrow the market is narrow, the share is smaller, so you have a bigger problem. But it is recognized increasingly, I think, by all that a market definition is not an exact science, because you can never design the boundaries of a market with great precision. And also that there are nuances in terms of the degree of competition. The extent to which companies compete with one another is not binary, yes or no. There is going to be some degree of differentiation. Markets are in the main differentiated and segmented, either geographically or in terms of the product characteristics. And so to draw a hard boundary and say everything in here matters and this is the market share, everything just outside this perimeter doesn't matter and I don't look at it, is actually not very helpful or not very right. So if one was able to do market definition in a way that was dispositive and remove all doubts, then of course it would be a useful shortcut. But the reality is that we don't do that because we don't really know how to do it in a dispositive way, even with all of the economic analysis that we have at our disposal. So I would say that in many jurisdictions, market definition is a legal requirement. So, you go to the European Commission or anywhere, you need to file a merger, you need to provide market shares. And so you do it. You, however, I would always advise to say, let's not hang our hat on the market definition. We have to do it. We provide different definitions that are plausible. And indeed, if under different plausible definition, the market share is small, then we go home, right? Because there's no reason to do much more. At that point, you've been effectively discharging your obligation. You've shown that under many different definitions of the conceivable market, the market shares combined are small. Why should anyone worry more about it? But in fact, beyond that, one should really consider much more what the evidence tells you about the closeness of competition, because it is that closeness of competition that in the end sort of determines whether you're able to implement a price increase or not. And, I have a couple of examples that I want to somehow tee up in the slides. One is an example I like particularly because it is a homegrown example. It is the Netcare acquisition of Akeso in the last few months, on which I advised with you. And what was nice about that case is that we were able to effectively sort of sidestep and move away from a big discussion on market definition. The market there, could have been cut in various different ways. You were talking about in-hospital psychiatric services, but you could have segmented it in various ways. And effectively, the answer there was, look, let's not get bogged down on the definition of the market. Let's ask the fundamental question. Is Netcare competing head-to-head with this chain of clinics for the particular patient and the particular referrals on the part of doctors? That was accepted by the authorities as being the relevant question. So in a number of cases, you really kind of sidestep the market definition and zoom into the key piece, which is how significant is that constraint. Now, perhaps it is, if you allow me, an opportunity to jump as an example into Sainsbury Asda, which is a case that we're doing here in Europe. Of course, I cannot say too much about it because, of course, the case is pending. Just to say, of course, it's well known, this is a merger of two major grocery retailers in the UK, 50 billion in value. And what I will say is that when you look at the way in which the UK Competition Authority have looked at grocery mergers in the past, and there is a long history of this, it has traditionally been identifying a local catchment area defined in some way, driving time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and so on. And then any store that was inside that driving catchment area was considered part of the market. And then effectively the rule for divestment was that, if you had a certain number or greater than a certain number of stores in that local catchment area, then that was a strong candidate for divestment. But it was very much a binary case, in or out. You're either in the catchment area with the target or you're not. I think what has happened over time, and certainly will play a major part in this case, is the fact that the competition, the CMA in the UK has recognized that competition is ultimately there is a strength of constraint which isn't constant. You don't have the same constraint between two stores depending on whether they are located next to each other or they are some distance. So distance matters to consumers very greatly in this kind of retail cases. And so the further away is a store in a given catchment area, the less of a close competitor it is. The implication of this is that you end up not just counting the stores in the catchment area, but actually attributing a weight to them, which is a function of distance. And so then there is a debate to be had about, if something is twice as far, does it count as twice as the less, so less half the competitive constraint? Of course, you have to consider the size of the store, the characteristics of the stores, and so on. But what is important is that there is now a formal recognition that it's not simply a question of, defining your local market and then everything in there is equally weighted. There is a degree of closeness of competition that reflects distance, and that is taken now into account. And of course, it will matter in the assessment of divestment. So I'm saying that this idea of closeness of competition is now pretty pervasive as a criterion for the assessment, and I think with good reason, because the market share is just crude and blunt and often doesn't tell you very much.
And can I ask you, in a sort of retail context of the type that you're describing, obviously in some local markets there will be multiple competitors, and how does one reach an assessment of how many remaining competitors is enough post-transaction? So, just to give a hypothetical example, if in a local market players 1 and 6 are combining, but there will still be 4 remaining players behind. Does one say, well, 4 remaining players is sufficient, or does one need to look at the nature of the 4 remaining players and see to what extent they have similar offerings, similar policies, target the same LSM categories as the parties that are merging?
I think that it's fair to say that it is a bit of a two-step analysis. I mean, in a country like the UK, on a deal of this size, you're going to have hundreds of local markets in which there are overlaps. And so you need to obviously kind of start with looking at the presence of others. But inevitably, you will have to take a very micro view when you're looking at the individual catchment areas about the characteristics of the stores and their distance from the party stores. It ends up being a fairly micro analysis that takes on board very strongly the specificities of the location. There will be some sort of initial kind of rule of thumb whereby you rule out certain areas as being non-problematic. That's clear. But when it comes to a situation where you go 5 to 4, 4 to 3 in a catchment area, and you can flex the catchment area, right? These days you have software that kind of sort of flexes the catchment area 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you can see what you're left with in terms of the stores. But you need to inevitably look at the characteristics and the type of stores that are in there. So if you have a Lidl or an Aldi, it's different from whether you have a Waitrose, for example, over in the UK. So that kind of microanalysis needs to be done at the level of ultimately having narrowed down the problematic overlaps.
And Cristina, can I ask you about your views about market dynamics? And what I mean by that is, obviously, some markets are more prone to change and to the influx of new competitors than others. And just to give a few examples, probably a few years ago, the market for metered taxis, in the UK was probably a relatively stable market with market shares that remained relatively static. And then along came Uber. And overnight, market shares changed. And, thinking about other markets like the market for videos, at one point there was the local corner store where you would go and get your DVD or video. And then along came Netflix and, it revolutionized, those types of markets, and market shares, which historically may have counted for something, actually counted for nothing very shortly thereafter. So just wanted to get your take on market dynamics and how does one sort of adjust for markets where market shares might change very quickly as a consequence of technology or other changes in consumer patterns or trends?
Well, this is a super interesting area. I'm doing a number of cases in this area, and I want to mention a couple because they're different and yet they're interesting in their own right. So the first one is a case, again, a UK case. It seems to be that I'm mentioning mostly UK cases, but not quite. So there is this merger that was approved early this year, or late last year, the Just Eat Hungry House. And these two are effectively takeaway aggregators, right? They are platforms that bring restaurants and consumers together. You can order the food and then they go and collect it, and then you can order the food on the platform and then the restaurant will deliver the food. And if you took this is another case in which if you took a narrow definition of the market and you thought about the market defined as the business model, this particular platform aggregator, that was just pretty much them at the time. And this was a merger to monopoly in many ways. And the way in which this was eventually approved unconditionally by the competition authority was on ground that one, there was evidence that one of the two parties was significantly more successful than the other. So Just Eat was much more successful than the other one. And ultimately, this merger was probably end up going to be a winner-take-all in which the other party was going to fade. But it didn't mean that this was going to be a permanent monopoly, because there was also evidence that there were others in the wing that were sort of growing slowly and not slowly, in fact, quite fast, and potentially challenging this temporary monopoly. So this is a very good example of a case in which if you had defined the market narrowly, as one often does in these cases, based on the business model alone, you would have found that this was a merger to 100%, and therefore you could have said this is not acceptable. And yet a combination of a recognition that the target was not going to be a challenger for long, and the fact that entry was sort of possible and indeed was happening, allowed the CMA to get comfortable with the idea that this could be a temporary monopoly for a while. And so that is a case in which market dynamics played an enormous role, and being able to describe it properly and having a fairly dynamic agency there, people listened, was very instrumental. You mentioned Uber, and it's a case I also want to mention I'm involved in. As a number of you know, Uber is burning cash rather aggressively in order to be able to be present in a number of markets. And the reality of this kind of business, in which you are trying to expand and create demand for these kind of ride-hailing, ride-sharing services in competition with the traditional taxis and so on, is the reality in which you need to just make enormous investments up front in introductory pricing, investment in getting drivers and riders onto the platform. And so you basically lose money forever until, and the dynamic is not really played out in these markets. So a company like Uber is present in 70 countries, and it is fighting head to head with the likes of Didi and others, Grab in Southeast Asia and so on. There are mergers that are going through now. So it has decided to pull away from certain markets. Southeast Asia is one. And the question that the regulators are facing is, well, are we seeing a situation here in which in this business, we are perhaps observing something like a natural monopoly? Somebody needs to win in the end, and it's only the one with the deepest pockets. And should we allow a merger in which, say, Uber sells to their main rivals because it's going to lead you to have a monopoly in the end? Or can we believe that entry will occur and will dissipate price increases? So this is the question which is at the moment very live in places like, all of Southeast Asia, where they're in phase 2 in every single country. But it is incredibly interesting because I think the economics of it is playing out in real time. We really don't know to what extent these kind of platforms are going to be able to favor a sort of sustained long-term equilibrium with multiple players, or is it a situation in which there is inevitably someone who is going to be prevailing for a while, but an attracting entry? So these are the real questions that are difficult to crack. And in these dynamic markets, you need to just try and nail a prediction, I'm afraid.
Right. And Cristina, I then wanted to ask you your take on the responses of customers and competitors in mergers, because we know that regulators go to competitors and to customers and source their views on transactions. And sometimes, competitors are inclined to give, particularly jaundiced views about a particular merger because they don't feel that it's in their competitive interest for the merger to succeed, but that doesn't necessarily mean the merger will be bad for consumer welfare. So I'd be interested just to get your sense of what level of importance competition agencies should attach to responses of customers and competitors in merger scenarios, and should they be giving more weighting to what customers say, or should they really give equivalent status to the responses from both customers and competitors?
Well, in horizontal mergers, unambiguously, what matters is what customers say, much more than what competitors say. And in fact, if you are going to look at what happens to competitors, the extent to which their share price goes down on announcement of the merger should be taken as a favorable indicator for the merger, because it does suggest that people predict that they're going to be subject to more competition. Vice versa, if a merger announcement leads to competitors having a share price increase, well, that suggests the market is effectively factoring in a reduction in competition that benefits competitors. So I think in a number of places, the competition authorities are well versed to understanding that the views of competitors in horizontal merger should be somewhat discounted. But, life being what it is, of course, agencies are also very much sort of at the receiving end of a heavy degree of lobbying and submission on the part of all sides, including competitors. And so to discern sort of meritorious argument from rubbish requires a certain degree of discipline. I accept that.
Now, can I ask you an issue which often arises, which is, should regulated sectors where there's already a regulator and sometimes a price regulator, and you see this in electricity markets, in telecoms, in some energy markets, etc., where prices are already regulated, in your view, should those sort of markets be treated differently from a merger perspective than sort of markets which are not regulated? And the logic sometimes that's expressed is to say, well, if your central consideration is whether prices will increase post-merger, and where the markets are already regulated by a sector regulator, well, should you have the same degree of concern? And would be interested in your views on that.
Well, I mean, price is not the only parameter of competition. Price and quality sort of matter. So, there can be, if one doesn't regulate also the quality of supply, the quality of provision, the kind of quality of service, then you can argue that one of the adverse effects of a merger where prices are capped could be to worsen quality, for example. So I don't think regulation in and of itself preempts the notion of merger effect. It depends on every case on how binding is that regulation? And I, in my experience, never find that regulation is so fully, completely binding unless there is a real sort of price regulation, tariffs are set and nothing can change. But, I mean, again, to take the Uber case, I mean, in many places like the Philippines, there is a very detailed regulation of supply and tariffs, and yet, you cannot, I think, realistically conclude that there is absolutely no scope for an algorithm to be smart enough to increase prices on some dimension. So I think that depending on the market, I think it is legitimate for a competition regulator to want to look at whether price and quality adverse changes would occur, even if there is regulation.
Mm. Cristina, now I want to move to the somewhat contentious topic on slide 5 of remedies. And, often, sometimes the most contentious part of merger evaluation. And obviously there are often two schools of thought. Some competition regulators will say to you that behavioral remedies are too difficult to police and too easy to evade, and that parties can get around them, and that there's a strong preference for structural remedies or prohibition. And the other issue that often goes hand in hand with remedy analysis is the question of efficiencies, because I think it's arguable that competition regulators often don't take efficiency arguments particularly seriously. And I think in a lot of jurisdictions, competition lawyers are now quite skeptical about how far they should push efficiencies, because they just tend to get discounted. So I'd be interested in two things. One, your view on efficiency analysis, and does it still have a role to play in merger analysis? And secondly, your view on structuring remedies and how to approach the often vexed question of remedies when you're trying to get a deal through.
Yes. Well, I feel strongly that one needs to be able to tell an efficiency story. And my advice is always to say, look, think about the rationale for the deal as your sales pitch to the regulator as to why you're doing it. You need to tell the regulator, I'm not just doing this for my own good, which of course they understand, and you wouldn't be doing it otherwise. But there is some form of enhancement of my ability to compete, and therefore consumers benefit that flows out of here. The problem is we are in a chicken and egg situation, I think, Anthony, because I'm involved in so many mergers in which efficiencies don't even get talked about. It becomes a complete afterthought because there is this perception on the part of the legal community that regulators are not listening. Now, when I talk to my friends inside the chief economist team at the European Commission, they say the opposite. They say, why should we bother our heads with efficiencies when the parties don't come and tell us about them, right? They never come forward with anything concrete and quantifiable. And if they don't submit that an efficiency is material, why should we be the ones to pursue it? And I think the truth is in between. I think that there is a reluctance to put forward these stories. And as a result, regulators don't really elicit them ultimately. And I think that my experience is also that when you think about what is, when you want to make the case at the very last minute that there are efficiencies because you realize that the merger is in trouble, all that people come up with is something fairly small. I've seen efficiencies being claimed that, were fairly small and therefore didn't move the dial. So I would say that absolutely my advice would be to say, if you're considering a difficult merger, you need to sell a story for this merger to the competition authority, because otherwise they'll only see the toxic part of the deal. Why should I like the Bull-Rexam deal, which is toxic in every way because it's creating overlaps in every conceivable country and every conceivable dimension of cans, unless you tell me that there are going to be massive logistic and other cost savings that will enable you to do this. And remarkably, these kind of efficiencies are often, as I say, left for sort of the last minute, or people don't bother to articulate them or measure them or put them forward. And it's extraordinary because we have economic tools that can actually incorporate efficiencies in the prediction of price increases. So left to their own devices, prices go up by X, but if you incorporate a cost, the synergy of X, then prices will go up by Y, and it's much better, isn't it? So I think efficiencies, are the orphan here. And I think that advisors ought to be pushing companies to really just articulate them a lot better and more concretely than is done currently. On remedies, this is a difficult area because, as you say, there is this deep dislike of authorities for behavioral remedies, and nonetheless, sometimes they are what they are, in the sense that you don't have a structural divestment available. In Europe, we've had countless examples of, for example, telco mergers between mobile operators, in which you were going from 4 to 3 MNOs, and then the remedy that ultimately was accepted was initially very much just an access remedy, right? You are merging, you're creating a big MNO, and then you are giving a little bit to an MVNO that allegedly and supposedly will compete. Now, of course, the penny has dropped that if you are going to be the one who is controlling price and quantity of access to the MVNO, then it's not going to be a very effective competitor to you. And so these remedies have become less and less acceptable, to the point that the most recent one in Italy last year by the European Commission effectively was a 4 to 3 back to 4, because they had to recreate a fourth player, exactly an MNO, pretty much with the bits and limbs of the original parties. So behavioral remains difficult in horizontal mergers, and I think very much something that doesn't really have much of a place. But on the other hand, frankly, structural is also problematic, because the ambition is that one should restore competitive dynamics pre-merger. And frankly, it's very hard to establish for a regulator what collection of assets would establish that pre-merger competition again. So, particularly people who don't have business expertise or experience are sitting there sort of making judgments about, we want, another 2 plants, 3 plants, 4 plants, and who knows really about whether that is going to be sufficient to just create, and who are you selling it to? It needs to be an outsider. It needs to be somebody without a current presence in the industry. Really? But then how do they know anything? How can they compete effectively if they are an outsider? It cannot be a PE play because they know nothing. Okay, so all of these restrictions are increasingly placed that I can see on divestment. Certainly in Europe, there is a sort of a set of requirements. It needs to be at least X% of the increment. It needs to be somebody who is not in the industry. It needs to be somebody who is not a current player. So it can be somebody with no experience, with no market share, who's a complete outsider and buys this stuff. But it cannot be PE because they know nothing. And so, seriously, I think that the question of remedies is very vexed. And ultimately, it is a matter of, I can tell you from an economic perspective, if I have a model that tells me how much prices will go up, how much of the capacity you need to sell down in order to eliminate the price increase. But it becomes a much more camel trade, frankly, with competition authority based on fairly spurious considerations in my experience.
And I think arguably, just to add to what you're saying, I mean, ironically, I think, sometimes pricing remedies where there is a pricing formula or something like that is arguably sometimes more effective, because it's transparent and open to the market, and people know, what sort of prices have to be charged, and provided, of course, you get the amount and the structure right. That can sometimes be a more effective remedy than divesting an asset.
Well, arguably, yes. Yes, because I think our ability to, I often sit in this meeting and I have utmost respect for the European Commission, but, we are faced with people whose job is to be regulators. And you have this surreal conversation where on one side of the table there is all the business people, and on the other side there are the agency people who have never spent a day in business in their life. And they sort of debate what would be a collection of assets that would restore competition. And you think, am I sort of dreaming this? And how can this be a sensible conversation? But it is what it is. So in many ways, I don't disagree. Something which is more prescriptive, like somehow we have a lot of faith in markets, and we do, but markets are not necessarily always delivering what you'd expect.
Cristina, while people are digesting those thoughts, we're going to ask my colleague Avias just to give us a very quick review of some of the merger statistics in South Africa, just for 2 or 3 minutes. And I think it's an opportunity for anyone who's on the line who wants to pose any specific questions to Cristina, just to send them through, and then we can deal with any of those as soon as Avias has given us a brief summary of the merger statistics over the last 2 years.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. Look, I thought it would be very helpful to go through some statistics which the South African Competition Commission generally publishes in its annual report. And so these numbers are merger activity numbers, and they set out to give an overview of the types of mergers that the competition authorities are faced with, what trends they observe over time, and how they're approaching, to some extent you can sort of glean how they're approaching merger analysis. Are they aggressively pursuing conditions? Are they more lenient in how they consider certain transactions? And so what we try to do in the slide is to just give an overview from the latest report published by the Competition Commission, which is the 2016-2017 report. And what this report essentially shows one is the number of mergers filed over the period 2013 to 14 up to 2016-17. So these are financial years running from March to April. And essentially what the Commission does is it provides a breakdown according to merger categories. So they've got large mergers, intermediate mergers, and small mergers. And what we observe when we look at the trends is overall, over time, the number of mergers being assessed by the Competition Commission has increased. And it has increased quite significantly over the period, from roughly 320 transactions in 2013-14 to over 400, sitting at 418 in 2016-17. So the amount of transactions the Commission is assessing has increased by roughly 30%. And what's more important is when you really look at the numbers, you see that the majority of transactions get approved without any difficulty. And on average, this number ranges from 83% of all notified transactions in any given year would be approved without any conditions or remedies being imposed. But what's happening is, increasingly over the period, you're seeing more and more mergers being approved with condition. And then importantly for the discussion that we've just had, a number of these conditions are conditions centered around public interest. So when you look at the number of mergers which approved conditionally in 2013-14, there were only 22 mergers which approved conditionally. This number increased significantly in the following year to 43. And although it's dropped by a little bit, it's still increased to 31 in 2016-17. And just for our purposes, when you consider the type of conditions that are being imposed by the competition authorities, and focusing specifically on the number of what we refer to as public interest conditions. So conditions which are geared specifically at protecting the number of employees within a merged entity, or conditions which are aimed at protecting really small and medium enterprises which may engage as suppliers or customers of the merged entity. The Competition Commission has essentially taken a very aggressive approach to ensuring that those stakeholder interests are protected. So, for example, in 2016-17, half of the conditional approvals essentially had public interest conditions imposed on them. And 8 of those were specifically geared at, employment conditions. So essentially the Commission was in those transactions indicating that there should be no merger-specific job losses associated with those transactions. In 3 of those, or in 4 of those rather, there were conditions imposed which was clearly and specifically aimed at protecting the interests of small suppliers. So these are SMMEs, or small and medium enterprises, which would contract with the merged entities. And this is an important consideration because you not only look at the impact on competition as a whole, what the South African Competition Commission in particular is saying is, if you're merging and that merger could effectively undermine small suppliers or small customers that the merged entity deals with, you need to take that into account. So that's an added consideration, which we haven't really seen being considered in detail in the past. And the last three mergers were a combination of both. So they had some aspect of protecting small, medium enterprises and at the same time also ensuring that the employees of the merged entity aren't necessarily undermined by the transaction. And lastly is just the number of prohibitions that we're starting to see. And really you're seeing a more aggressive approach by the Competition Commission to merger assessment. It's more detailed. They want more information to be able to obtain the comfort that they're happy that this transaction isn't going to lead to any form of substantial lessening of competition. And when you look at the number of prohibitions, I mean, they've increased from 1 in 2013-14 to 5 in 2016-17. And that just shows the scope to which the competition authorities are really looking at mergers more carefully and not just giving blanket approvals to parties. And I think that's been our experience as well in some of the transactions that we've engaged in, is even where we believe there aren't really any concerns, the Commission tends to spend a lot of time, go into a lot of detail in really trying to analyze and assess these transactions.
Cristina, have you had a sort of similar experience in Europe and in other jurisdictions where you think the scrutiny and level of engagement with the competition authorities is increasing and that there's a greater propensity for conditions and prohibition?
This is something that comes up periodically, I have to say, the question of whether merger control is getting tougher. I don't necessarily think that is the case. I mean, I think people have short memories in the sense that, I have been around long enough to remember times when the Commission prohibited cases like air tours or cases like GE Honeywell or Tetra Fidel and so on. And these kind of derailments would no longer occur. I mean, I think those were cases that were at the time considered already controversial, but it was a time when the Commission really was not understanding conglomerate mergers, vertical mergers. They didn't understand coordinated effects. Things have moved on enormously. I think that there is a very small minority of cases which is being prohibited. And, some people say not enough is being prohibited outright because you end up with some sort of compromises over some sort of mergers that have got no real merit with some sort of condition that don't work, and frankly would have been better to prohibit them outright. So I don't think that the case is that there is any sort of a visible tightening of the screws here. It's just I think they're getting a bit better with the analysis, and some things are being caught, but no more. I think with more merit than before, in my view.
Okay. I want to end off just briefly just with a sense of some proposed changes to the merger regime in South Africa and some potential developments in merger analysis if the amendments to the Competition Act that have been proposed by the Department of Economic Development are introduced. And in essence, it appears that these are motivated by government's concern that there is still too much concentration in various sectors and industries in South Africa, and that concentration has to change. And it's also driven, I think, by considerations that not only must the levels of concentration reduce, but the levels of ownership in those sectors by previously disadvantaged persons has to increase, and also linked to to be focused in three areas. The one is a greater analysis and requirement that parties must disclose common shareholders that they may have in competing entities. That appears to be one critical consideration. What I would loosely describe as creeping mergers. And the idea here is that companies must disclose mergers that they've done in the last 3 years irrespective of size, whether those are small, large, intermediate, etc., to enable the competition authorities to get a sense of how many transactions they've done over a period of time, and whether, effectively, to use Christina's earlier example, they're like an Uber buying up lots of smaller players and lots of smaller competitors. So if these changes come through, there will be a greater need for companies to make disclosure when they file about the extent to which they have common shareholders in relation to businesses which compete in the same sector, the extent to which they have overlapping directors in relation to companies which compete in the same markets or sectors, and the extent to which they've affected various transactions over a 3-year period. And all of this appears to be aimed at ensuring that there are not sort of increased levels of coordination in particular sectors or markets, and that companies are not stealthily buying up various players in particular sectors or industries. And I think the bottom line is that if these amendments come into being, there will obviously be a much greater onus on merging parties to make disclosure in their merger notification documents, and also a much greater assessment and a greater level of scrutiny by competition authorities in looking at overlapping levels of directorships and common shareholdings in industries. So I think all in all, the bottom line is that there will be much more intensive scrutiny of horizontal mergers between competitors. And while that's likely to mean more work for lawyers and economists, it is going to mean, a much greater degree of preparation by emerging companies before they get into these types of deals. I want to wrap up, and Cristina, ask you just to give your few closing thoughts on horizontal mergers, and if there are any particular thoughts you want to leave the people on the call with today in that regard.
Well, I will be brief. I feel I've spoken enough. I think that I suppose the key message from this session is that there is, of course, a huge variety of circumstances in markets in which we find horizontal mergers to be pursued, but the fundamental logic of what we're trying to do as economists and indeed also as lawyers is to nail that fundamental question that I described before. And today we have enough understanding and knowledge about how to use company data to be able to make fairly precise predictions about that famous question to enable companies to be reasonably prepared to confront a competition authority. Of course, there are broader concerns that are developing. You mentioned the cross-shareholding. There is a big area of common ownership that's coming up as also an area of concern in the mind of regulators. All of this needs to be factored into the preparation. But I think there is reasonable good knowledge and intelligence now as to what works and doesn't, and a lot of homework can help. That's what I would say.
Cristina, I just want to echo what you've said, and I think that the difference often between successful mergers and unsuccessful ones is the degree of planning and preparation and the close interaction between the lawyers and the economists to make sure that all the bases are covered and that a full and detailed analysis is done. And certainly in my experience, that makes the difference between the mergers that succeed and those that don't, particularly ones which may be contentious. Cristina, it just leaves it to me to say thank you very much for your time on the call today. We really appreciate your insights and views in this quite interesting area, and look forward to seeing what's going to happen in some of these interesting transactions going forward.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.